All right, good morning. We are going to read part 3 and part of chapter 12 from the Landmark History of the American People. And so we're going to look at this beautiful picture right here. It says, immigrants to the United States stand on Ellis Island and look at the Statue of Liberty. This is an oil painting over a photograph, and it's from 1920. So part 3, people on the move. Americans were people on the move. There would have been nobody in America except the Indians unless millions of people from the Old World had been willing to cross the ocean. The United States might have been only a string of seaboard farms and cities if brave new Americans had not been willing to risk the move farther west. Going into the half-map continent meant, of course, traveling into the unknown, but Americans were willing, even eager, to risk the new places. The Civil War, too, meant the moving of peoples. Thousands of men fought great battles in armies that moved all over the countryside. The fortunes of war brought Virginians to Gettysburg and Pennsylvania and sent Massachusetts volunteers deep into Georgia. Even while the armies of General William T. Sherman cut their bloody swath through the South, the Union men could not help seeing the beauties of the Southern land. They discovered that Southerners were not so different from themselves. Thousands of Americans pried into far corners of their country. After the war, many soldiers returned to their homes. A few stayed where they had fought and found wives and homes in the new places. Some Northerners went south to teach school or help in the Freemasons' Bureau. From the burnt-over South, hopeful Southerners went north or west in search of opportunity. Black men and women, at last free to leave the old plantation for the first time, were able to move about like other Americans. Go ahead became an American motto. Of course, go-getting Americans were eager to move up in the world, but they were just as eager to move around. The same spirit that before the Civil War had led Americans to move westward in wagon towns, that had led them to build railroads even before there were cities to go to, now led Americans to move and to keep moving. After the Civil War, brave and needy men and women from around the world were still willing to risk the ocean to come to America, build the land, and crowd the cities. Many had come from impoverished European farms because they had heard extravagant promises. And thousands already in America were disappointed by the American land. They moved hopefully to the cities. The Americans kept telling themselves, go ahead, move on, try to find a better place. As Americans churned about the vast continent, they came to know their land and to know one another. Most nations of the Old World were rooted to the same spot. Their people were held together because their ancestors had lived so long inside the same boundaries. It was unusual for them to move. They learned to be satisfied with their place. But Americans would not let themselves be confined anywhere for long. Americans were held together by their ways of moving and by their shared desire to move. And the freedom to move to a better place helped build the nation. Awesome. So this says, during the Civil War, Northern Democrats were, in general, less favorable toward the war than were Republicans. After all, it was a Republican president who had gotten the Union into war. But one group of Democrats was especially opposed. They saw President Lincoln as a tyrant who had little respect for the values of liberty on which the United States had been founded. Some tried to persuade Union soldiers to desert. That means to leave their post, leave what they're defending. They talked of helping Confederate prisoners of war escape. This group called themselves Peace Democrats. Their opponents called them Copperheads. There were two reasons for the Copperhead name. One, the leaders of the group had begun to cut the likeness of liberty from the large copper pennies of the day, larger than our modern quarters, and they wore her likeness on their lapels as a kind of badge. It says, "We are for liberty." But two, the Copperhead is a venomous snake, and those who opposed these peace Democrats viewed them as being vile and deadly as copperhead snakes. When the Civil War finally ended in 1865, most Northerners believed that the Peace Democrats had hurt the North by encouraging the South to continue fighting. Here, in the political cartoon from 1863, the Union has to fight off the leading Midwest Democratic congressman. So, we just kind of talked about what a peace Democrat was. And peace Democrats were people who opposed the war, right? They opposed the Civil War. And they were trying to get the Union soldiers to desert or to leave their posts and no longer fight alongside of the Union army. So they considered President Lincoln to be kind of like a tyrant, somebody who was just in charge of everything, and he didn't really care or respect the values for liberty. And we obviously know that that is not true, that Lincoln was fighting for everybody to have freedoms and their liberty. So we're going to move over to chapter 12, to punish or to forgive. Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox brought peace to the nation, but peace brought new problems. How could the millions of men who left the Union and Confederate armies find jobs? How could factory owners change their factories from making cannons, rifles, and ammunition to making harvesters and sewing machines? When the South agreed to unconditional surrender, they put themselves at the mercy of the North. This gave Northerners their most difficult problem: what to do with the South. Was it more important to punish the former rebels, to teach them a lesson they would never forget, so they would never again try to break up the Union? Or was it better to forgive the rebels, to welcome them back into the Union, so they would feel at home and never again want to leave? Of course, the South had already been punished. 250,000 Southerners had died in the war. The Confederacy was a land of cinders and desolation, of charred plantation houses, broken bridges, twisted railways, and desecrated churches. The imagery in that was very beautiful, wasn't it? Just the description of what it looked like was so detailed just now. So an Englishman who traveled halfway across the South said he did not see a single smiling face. But the North had also suffered, with its own 250,000 dead. And for Northerners who had lost fathers, sons, or husbands, no punishment of the South seemed enough. Yet this was not just a question of feelings. Unless the North wanted to feed and house millions of Southerners, it was important to get the South back into working order. This meant getting crops planted, factories built, railroads running, and pupils and teachers into schools. It also meant getting the southern states organized to govern themselves, to collect their own taxes, to keep the peace, and to protect life and property. But it was not easy to get people to agree on how to revive the southern states. There was a wide disagreement on what the war had really meant. What the North called the War of the Rebellion, the South called the War between states. The Southerners argued that their state governments had never been destroyed. Once a state, always a state. Lincoln himself had almost agreed with the Southerners on this point. He also believed once a state, always a state. But for Lincoln, this meant that the Southern states had no power to succeed. And if the Southern states had never really succeeded, then after the Civil War, the Southern states were still within the Union. Naturally, once the war was over, Southerners wanted to agree with Lincoln. They said they still had their states and therefore could still run their own affairs. The most, then, that the victorious North could properly ask was that some Confederate leaders be barred from office. Right? So they're saying they've always been states, right? And the most the North could ask is it's just a couple of people couldn't serve in office anymore, which is kind of crazy. But on the other side were the Northern Avengers. The most powerful of them were in a group called Northern Senators and Congressmen called Radical Republicans. They were bitter against the Southern rebels. They remained suspicious of all white Southerners. They did not want to forgive and to forget, but instead wanted to rub salt in the Southern wounds. When you say rub salt in a wound, it means if you have a cut and you put salt in it, it hurts really bad. So they wanted to make them suffer. The Southern states said the radical Republicans had actually committed suicide. So the Northern Avengers were a group of the Northern senators and congressmen, right? And they called themselves those radical Republicans. And they wanted the South to suffer. They wanted them to just really be punished, okay? So we got to keep that in mind as we continue. By trying to rebel, the Southerners had not only violated the Constitution, but actually destroyed their own states. They were no longer states. So that's what the radical Republicans believed. They said, you're not even a state anymore, right? Because they had rebelled, they violated the Constitution, and therefore they had no rights as states. And so they were kind of in the idea that, well, if you're not a state, we can treat you as if we've conquered you, and we can govern you with, whatever we want, with military or whatever. So it's a very interesting way to think. That's those radical Republicans. So people who thought like this believed that after the war with Southern states, the Southern states could claim no rights under the Constitution. They had no right to govern themselves or to be represented in the Senate or the House of Representatives. They were nothing but so much territory, like parts of the other sparsely settled West. And like those Western territories, Congress could govern them any way they wanted. So like I said a few minutes ago, they said, these radical Republicans said, you have no rights. And we can actually see here a picture of Charleston, South Carolina. And it says, ruins of Charleston, South Carolina, by the pioneer Civil War photographer Mathew Brady. For many people in the South, Reconstruction after the Civil War meant clearing away the rubble and rebuilding cities. So we're going back to the radical Republicans. So they believed that Congress could treat them as conquered provinces. They could rule them by military governors, generals of the army. When, if ever, Congress would allow them to govern themselves and take part in the national government, this would depend on how they behaved themselves and what the victorious Congress wanted. This offered anything but a cheerful prospect for the Southerners. The leader of the radical Republicans was one of the strangest men in American history. Thaddeus Stevens was sometimes called a humanitarian without humanity. So that's a very interesting way to describe somebody. He seemed to use up all his good feelings on large, noble causes, but then he had very little left for individuals. Stevens was a sour man. Just as Lincoln inspired love and respect, Stevens inspired fear. And here we can see a picture of Thaddeus Stevens. And he was a congressman from Pennsylvania and the leader of the radical Republicans. After Appomattox, Stevens made it his purpose in life to punish all Southern traitors. Old age never mellowed him. At age 75, he boasted that he would spend his remaining years inventing new ways to make the Southern rebels suffer. So this is another oil painting over a photograph, and it was done in 1860 by Mathew Brady, same guy who took this picture right here. So very early in life, Stevens took up the great cause of abolishing slavery. Great cause. He never gave it up, nor did he ever forgive men who had ever held slaves or who had been entangled in the web of slavery. After Appomattox, Stevens made it his life purpose to punish all traitors. Old age never mellowed him. At the age of 75, he boasted that he would spend his remaining years inventing new ways to make the Southern rebels suffer. During the Civil War, Lincoln had shown his greatness and his forgiving spirit. Had shown his greatness and his forgiving spirit by his plan to bring Southerners back to the Union. He was less interested in the past than the future. Back on December 8th, 1863, in his proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction, he explained his plan. Sorry. He would pardon almost all Southerners, even if they had fought against the Union. All Lincoln asked was that the Southerners take a solemn oath to support the Constitution of the United States in the future. As soon as enough citizens of the Southern state took the oath, Lincoln would recognize the government of that state and let the people govern themselves. Of course, they must agree to abolish slavery. Lincoln said that it would be enough if a number equal to only 1/10 of the voters in the last election took the oath. This plan did not satisfy the radical Republicans. They were busy in Congress making a plan of their own. During the war, they concocted their Wade-Davis bill in quite another spirit. They could not take their eyes off the past. Under their plan, each Southern state had to make a list of all its white men. The state could not be recognized or given the power to govern itself until a majority of the people on that list took a new oath to support the Constitution. Then, said the radicals, since they believed that the old Southern states had committed suicide, there would have to be an election to call a convention to make an entirely new constitution for each Southern state. Okay, so we are seeing two very different ideas on how to run the country after the Civil War, right? Lincoln, he was very kind and very forgiving, and he said, listen, if at least 1/10 of your population votes to support the Constitution, then we forgive everybody. We give this proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction. We forgive everybody. We want to forgive. We want to move on. I'm interested in the future, not the past, right? And we see that Thaddeus Stevens is like, absolutely not. He wanted no forgiveness. He wanted to continue to punish the South, right? And so he came up with this Wade-Davis bill. And in the Wade-Davis bill, it had to be the majority, so that each Southern state had to make a list of all its white men. And unless the majority of the people on that list took the oath to support the Constitution, they weren't going to be supported. They would still be considered like a conquer. So no one could even vote in that election, much less be a delegate to make the new Constitution unless he took the ironclad oath. This oath was not merely a promise of future loyalty, but was also an oath of past purity. You had to swear that you had never held office under the Confederacy or fought in the Confederate Army. By the end of the war, most white men in the South could not honestly take the oath. Under the radical scheme, it would be years before any Southern state could set up a majority government for itself. So when you think about that, excuse me, they had such young people fighting in the Civil War, right? So we're talking that it would probably be 10, maybe 15 years before they would have a new generation that had never fought in with the Confederate. So basically it would be years before any Southern state could set up a majority government for itself. It would have to wait until the whole Civil War generation was dead. But that did not bother the radical Republicans. They were quite willing to keep the Southern states under military rule by Northern generals. They said they were in favor of liberty, but they were not willing to give it to the white Southerners. This was the Wade-Davis bill, and it passed Congress on July 2nd, 1864. It could not be law unless Lincoln signed it. What would Lincoln do? Well, knowing Lincoln and his good spirit, we can only assume that he would refuse to sign it. But he was shrewd. Instead of attacking it for being evil and vengeful, as he might have, or instead of saying simply that the plan for the South was the business of the president and not the Congress, he issued a new proclamation. He would not sign the Wade-Davis bill into law because he believed there should be other ways a Southern state could get back into working order. Any seceded Southern state that wanted to follow the Wade-Davis plan should feel free to do so. But there were now two possible paths. Any Southern state could choose between Lincoln's 1/10 plan and the Radicals' majority ironclad Oath plan. In the long run, of course, no Southern state would prefer the vengeful Radical plan. But still, Lincoln had done his best to avoid head-on clash with Congress. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln called his cabinet together to explain his policy to them. He urged them to use charity. He begged them to help end the wartime. That very night, when President Lincoln and his wife went to Ford's Theater in Washington to attend a play, there occurred one of the greatest disasters of the Civil War era and of all American history. It was less than a week after Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. An unsuccessful actor named John Wilkes Booth, who was an ardent Southern supporter, snuck quietly into Lincoln's box and shot the unguarded president in the back of the head. Lincoln died the next day. We cannot be sure what would have happened if Lincoln had lived, but we do know that Lincoln's combination of qualities were extremely rare. And so we're going to end right there, and we will pick up tomorrow with the final bit of chapter 12.